Blake Morrison had always believed in building things to last. As a 34-year-old structural engineer, he approached life the same way he approached bridges and skyscrapers, with careful planning, solid foundations, and unwavering integrity. His marriage to Tiffany had seemed like his greatest construction project, something beautiful they'd built together over 8 years. Blake came from humble beginnings in rural Montana, where his father ran a small construction business and his mother taught elementary school. He'd earned his engineering degree through scholarships and back-breaking summer jobs, never taking a handout he hadn't earned. That work ethic had served him well in Denver, where he'd risen to senior engineer at Pinnacle Design Group, overseeing major infrastructure projects across the Rocky Mountain region. Tiffany, on the other hand, had grown up in Denver's affluent Cherry Hills Village. Her father, Gerald, owned 3 successful car dealerships, and her mother, Donna, had never worked a day in her life. They'd met at a charity gala where Blake's firm was being honored for their pro bono work on a community center. Tiffany had been drawn to his quiet confidence and genuine nature, qualities that seemed exotic in her world of trust fund babies and social climbers. Their daughter Emma, now 6 years old, was the light of Blake's life. With her father's dark hair and serious brown eyes, she was precocious and kind, showing early signs of inheriting Blake's analytical mind. Blake had been looking forward to this business trip to Portland, knowing he'd return home to Emma's excited chatter about first grade and Tiffany's plans for their upcoming anniversary. The project in Portland had wrapped up ahead of schedule, a rare stroke of luck that allowed Blake to catch an earlier flight home. He'd planned to surprise Tiffany and Emma, maybe take them out for dinner at that Italian place Emma loved. The house was quiet when he entered through the garage, his rolling suitcase echoing in the marble foyer that had been Tiffany's first renovation demand after they'd bought the house. "Tiffany, Emma, I'm home," Blake called out, setting down his briefcase. The sound that reached him from upstairs made his blood freeze. It was Emma crying, not the dramatic wails of a tantrum, but the broken, defeated sobs of a child whose spirit was being crushed. Blake took the stairs 3 at a time, following the sound to the master bathroom. What he found there would replay in his mind like a nightmare for months to come. Emma, his brilliant, beautiful daughter, was on her hands and knees scrubbing the toilet bowl. She wore a pink apron that someone had written on with a cross and permanent marker. Toilet water and cleaning chemicals had splashed on her school clothes and in her hair. Standing behind her was Tiffany, arms crossed and smirking. Gerald sat on the bathroom's reading chair, his belly hanging over his belt as he nursed a beer. Donna leaned against the doorframe, filing her nails with practiced indifference. "Please, Mommy, I'm sorry about the cookie," Emma hiccuped through her tears. "I was just hungry." "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Tiffany snapped. "You need to learn there are consequences for taking what isn't yours." Gerald's gruff laugh filled the bathroom. "Might as well get used to cleaning, little girl. You're not smart enough for anything else. Being a maid suits your future just fine." The rage that filled Blake was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It started in his chest like molten steel and spread through his entire body. But Blake Morrison was a man of control, a man who calculated every move. Instead of exploding, he became perfectly, dangerously calm. "Emma, come here," he said quietly from the doorway. Her head snapped toward him, and Emma's face lit up through her tears. "Daddy!" She scrambled to her feet, nearly slipping on the wet floor. Blake knelt and opened his arms, catching her as she ran to him. He could smell the harsh cleaning products in her hair, see the red marks on her knees from the hard tile floor. Something fundamental shifted inside him. A foundation that had been solid for 34 years suddenly cracked beyond repair. "We're leaving," Blake said, lifting Emma into his arms. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded construction crews and boardrooms, but now it held something darker. "Blake, don't be ridiculous," Tiffany said with a nervous laugh. "She stole a cookie. She needed to learn." "We're leaving," Blake repeated, turning toward the door. "Now." He carried Emma to her room, grabbing her favorite stuffed elephant and a few changes of clothes. He could hear Tiffany's heels clicking behind him on the hardwood, her voice rising in pitch as she demanded explanations he wouldn't give. Blake, you're overreacting. My parents were just trying to help with discipline while you were gone. Emma needs structure. Blake stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face his wife. For 8 years, he'd looked at her with love, with hope, with the satisfaction of a man who'd built something worthwhile. Now he saw something else entirely. Weakness, cruelty, and a kind of petty evil that had been hidden beneath surface beauty. "If you ever," Blake said quietly, "if any of you ever touch my daughter again, you'll regret it for the rest of your very short lives." Gerald appeared in the hallway, his face red with indignation. "Now you listen here, boy. This is my daughter's house, and I'll be darned if some jumped-up construction worker tells me." The look Blake gave him could have frozen fire. Gerald's mouth snapped shut. Blake walked down the stairs, Emma clinging to his neck, and loaded her into his truck. As he backed out of the driveway, Blake could see Tiffany standing in the doorway, her parents flanking her. They looked confused, as if they couldn't understand why anyone would object to their treatment of a 6-year-old child. That night, in a hotel room downtown, Blake held Emma as she finally fell asleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. But it wasn't just anger he felt anymore. It was clarity. The marriage he'd thought was solid had been built on rotten foundations. The woman he'd loved had revealed herself to be someone he didn't know at all. Blake Morrison was a man who built things to last. But he was also a man who knew when something was beyond repair, when it needed to be torn down completely before something better could be built in its place. He'd spent 8 years building a life with Tiffany. Now, he wondered how long it would take to dismantle it completely. 3 weeks after leaving the house in Cherry Hills Village, Blake had established a new routine that centered entirely around Emma's well-being. They'd moved into a furnished apartment in Lodo, close enough to Emma's school that she could maintain some stability while everything else in her life was shifting. Blake had taken a temporary leave of absence from Pinnacle Design, using accumulated vacation time while he figured out his next moves. His boss, Tony Castanos, had been surprisingly understanding when Blake explained he was dealing with family issues. Tony was a family man himself, and he'd worked with Blake long enough to know that if Blake Morrison said he needed time, there was a very good reason. Emma was resilient in the way children often are, but Blake could see the damage the incident had done. She'd become quieter, more hesitant to express her needs or wants. The first time she'd asked him for a snack at the apartment, she'd immediately followed it with, "But it's okay if we don't have any, Daddy, I'm not really hungry." Blake had knelt down to her level, his heart breaking. "Emma, sweetheart, you can always tell me when you're hungry. You never have to ask permission to eat in our home. This is our safe place." The apartment was sparse but comfortable. Blake had let Emma choose the decorations for her room. She'd picked out purple curtains and a lamp shaped like a unicorn. Small things, but Blake knew that giving her choices was important after she'd been powerless in that bathroom. While Emma was at school, Blake had begun the methodical process of untangling his life from Tiffany's. Their bank accounts, credit cards, the house, Emma's custody arrangements, everything needed to be addressed. But Blake was approaching it like an engineering project, carefully analyzing each component before making his moves. He'd also hired a private investigator. Rodriguez Investigations wasn't much to look at, but Blake didn't care about appearances. He needed answers. A cramped office above a pawn shop in 5 Points, furnished with second-hand furniture and degrees on the wall that could have been bought online, but Miguel Rodriguez came highly recommended by Tony's divorce attorney, and when Blake sat across from the former cop's scarred desk, he found himself face to face with a man who understood that sometimes you needed to know exactly what you were dealing with before you could figure out how to handle it. "I need to know everything about my wife," Blake had told Rodriguez during their first meeting. "Her daily routine, where she goes, who she sees, who she talks to, everything." Rodriguez had studied Blake with dark eyes that made him wonder if he was asking too much. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, are you planning to hurt anyone? Because if you are, this conversation ends now, and I never met you." "I'm not planning to hurt anyone," Blake had replied. It was technically true. He wasn't planning to hurt anyone who didn't deserve the consequences of their actions. Rodriguez had quoted his fee, reasonable for what Blake was asking, and they'd shaken hands. "I'll have a preliminary report in a week," Rodriguez had said. "Fair warning, sometimes people don't like what they find out." "I'm past worrying about what I like," Blake had replied. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now, Blake sat in his truck outside Emma's school waiting for pickup time when his phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. "Report ready. Can you meet today?" Blake texted back. "After 4 p.m., my daughter needs to be somewhere safe." Rodriguez's office felt even smaller the second time around. The investigator sat behind his desk with a manila folder that looked disappointingly thin. Blake had been expecting something thicker, more comprehensive. "Before I show you this," Rodriguez said, "I want you to understand that what you do with this information is your choice. I'm just the messenger." Blake nodded. "Show me." Rodriguez opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. The first few were innocent enough. Tiffany at the grocery store, at her yoga class, having lunch with girlfriends at the country club. Blake recognized the routine. It was the same life she'd been living when they were together. Then Rodriguez laid out the next series of photos. Tiffany entering a hotel downtown, Tiffany in the hotel bar, sitting close to a man Blake didn't recognize, Tiffany kissing that same man in the hotel parking garage, Tiffany leaving the hotel 3 hours later, her hair disheveled and her dress wrinkled. Blake stared at the photos with the same clinical detachment he used when analyzing structural failures. He felt something inside him shift and settle like a building finding its center of gravity after an earthquake. "How long?" Blake asked. "Based on what I could confirm, at least 6 months," Rodriguez said. "Probably longer. The hotel staff knows them as regulars. They have a standing reservation every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon." Blake picked up one of the photos, a clear shot of Tiffany and her lover walking hand in hand toward the hotel entrance. The man was tall, athletic, probably in his early 30s. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to work for anything. "Who is he?" Blake asked. Rodriguez consulted his notes. "Rick Valdez, 29 years old, personal trainer at an upscale gym in Cherry Hills. Divorced, no kids, lives in a condo his ex-wife's settlement payments can't quite cover. He's got a reputation around town, specializes in bored housewives with money to burn." Blake set the photo down carefully. "What else?" "Your wife's been more active than just the affair. She's been talking to a divorce attorney, Patricia Henley, one of the most expensive in the city, based on her search history that I was able to access through the private investigator she hired to follow you. She's been planning this for months. She's building a case for full custody of your daughter and maximum alimony." Rodriguez pulled out another document. "She's also been documenting things to paint you as an unfit father. Late nights at work, business trips, that incident where you took Emma from the house. She's spinning it as you being unstable and potentially dangerous." Blake absorbed this information as if he were reading engineering specifications. Every detail mattered. Every fact was a piece of the foundation he was building for what came next. "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "Her parents are involved. Gerald's been bragging at his country club about how they're going to take that boy for everything he's worth. They've been telling people you abandoned your family, that you're having some kind of breakdown." Blake looked up from the photos. "They think they've already won. From where I sit, they think you're just going to roll over and accept whatever they throw at you," Rodriguez said. "They think because you came from nothing and they've got money and connections, you'll fold." Blake gathered the photos into a neat stack. "What would you do in my situation?" Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Me? I'd make sure they understood that just because someone's quiet doesn't mean they're weak. But I'd be smart about it. These people have money and lawyers and connections. You go at them head on, you'll lose." Blake stood up, tucking the folder under his arm. "How much do I owe you for the continuing surveillance?" "You want me to keep watching?" "I want you to watch everything," Blake said. "Every move they make, every conversation they have, every person they talk to. I want to know their routines, their habits, their weaknesses, all of them." Rodriguez quoted a number that would have made Blake wince a month ago. Now it just seemed like a reasonable investment. "And Mr. Rodriguez," Blake paused at the door. "I need you to look into Rick Valdez more carefully. His background, his history, his habits. I want to know what kind of man my wife chose over me." Rodriguez nodded, jotting down notes as Blake exited, his mind already churning with the next steps. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Blake sat at his kitchen table with the photos spread out in front of him. For 8 years, he had built his life around the idea that Tiffany was the woman he'd married, that their family was worth protecting and nurturing. Now, he understood that he'd been building on quicksand. But Blake Morrison knew how to work with unstable ground. You didn't try to build on it. You cleared it away completely and started fresh with solid bedrock. He looked at the photo of Tiffany and Rick Valdez one more time, memorizing the man's face. Then he gathered all the photos into the folder and locked it in the small safe he had bought for the apartment. Tomorrow, he'd start building something new, something that would last. Blake's return to work after a month of leave was met with the kind of respectful curiosity that his colleagues knew better than to voice directly. He had always been private about his personal life, and now that privacy served him well. When people asked how he was doing, he gave them the same answer, taking things one day at a time. What Blake didn't tell them was that those days were now structured around a very specific project. Tony Castanos had welcomed him back with a major assignment, a complete structural assessment of the Millennium Tower, a luxury high-rise that had developed some concerning foundation issues. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes project that Blake thrived on. But more importantly, it gave him a legitimate reason to work late, to take long lunches, and to travel around the city with the kind of freedom his investigation required. Rodriguez's reports had become more detailed over the past 2 weeks. Blake now knew that Tiffany and Rick's affair had been going on for over a year, predating his business trip to Portland by months. He knew that Rick Valdez had a pattern of seducing wealthy married women, using his position as their personal trainer to gain access to their lives and their trust. He knew that Tiffany wasn't Rick's only current conquest. There was also Catherine Bellwood, the wife of a prominent real estate developer, and Lisa Chun, whose husband owned a chain of upscale restaurants. But the most interesting information had come from Rodriguez's deep dive into Rick's background. Rick Valdez wasn't just a serial home wrecker. He was a man with expensive tastes and poor impulse control. His divorce settlement from his ex-wife had been substantial, but he'd burned through most of it on a failed investment in a trendy restaurant. His personal training business was successful, but not successful enough to support his lifestyle. He was 2 months behind on his condo payments and had racked up significant credit card debt. Rick Valdez was desperate for money, which made him predictable, and predictable people were easy to manipulate. Blake's plan had started to take shape 3 days ago over coffee with an old friend from college. Danny Clove had taken a different path after graduation, using his engineering degree to move into real estate development. He now owned a small but successful company that specialized in converting old buildings into trendy loft spaces. More importantly, Danny had a reputation for being willing to bend the rules when the project was right. "I need a favor," Blake had told Danny over lunch at a restaurant in Rhino. "But first, I need to know if you can keep your mouth shut." Danny had known Blake for 15 years. If Blake Morrison was asking for favors and demanding secrecy, something serious was happening. "What do you need?" "I need you to offer someone a job, a very specific someone under very specific circumstances." Blake had laid out his plan in broad strokes. Danny would discover Rick Valdez through a mutual contact at the gym. Danny would be looking for a fitness consultant for a new luxury residential complex he was developing. The job would pay extremely well, but it would require Rick to relocate to Los Angeles for 6 months to oversee the fitness center construction and hire staff. "This is about your wife, isn't it?" Danny had asked when Blake finished explaining. "This is about protecting my daughter," Blake had replied. It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Danny had agreed, with the understanding that Blake would owe him a significant favor in return. The next day, Rodriguez had reported that Rick had received a call from someone claiming to be referred by one of his clients. Rick had agreed to meet with Danny's company representative the following week. But removing Rick Valdez was only the first phase of Blake's plan. The second phase required a different kind of expertise. Blake's sister Lauren lived in Chicago, where she worked as a forensic accountant for one of the big consulting firms. Lauren Morrison Drake was 2 years older than Blake and had inherited their father's skeptical nature and their mother's sharp intellect. She'd been through her own bitter divorce 3 years earlier and had come out the other side harder and more cynical, but also more effective at protecting herself and the people she cared about. Blake called her on a Thursday evening after Emma had gone to bed. "Blake, wow, I haven't heard from you in months. How are you and Tiffany? How's my gorgeous niece?" "Tiff and I are getting divorced," Blake said without preamble, "and I need your help." Lauren was quiet for a moment. "Okay, what happened?" Blake told her about finding Emma in the bathroom, about the photos Rodriguez had taken, about Tiffany's plans to destroy him in court. Lauren listened without interrupting, the way she listened to clients who were trying to hide financial crimes. "So you want me to dig into their finances?" Lauren said when Blake finished. "I want you to dig into everything. Gerald's dealerships, Donna's shopping habits, Tiffany's spending patterns. I want to know where every dollar comes from and where it goes, and I want to know if there's anything that doesn't add up." "Blake, you know I can't just—" "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," Blake interrupted. "I'm asking you to do what you do for a living. Examine financial records and identify irregularities. The only difference is, instead of working for a corporation, you'd be working for your brother." Lauren was quiet for a long moment. "You're not the same person who called me last Christmas to complain about Tiffany buying too many decorations." "No," Blake agreed. "I'm not." "Good," Lauren said. "Lawrence was right. You were too trusting. Send me everything you have on them. I'll see what I can find." The third phase of Blake's plan was the most delicate, and it required him to do something that went against every instinct he'd developed over 34 years of life. He had to lie, convincingly, to people who thought they knew him. Blake called Tiffany for the first time since he'd left the house. She answered on the third ring, her voice carefully neutral. "Blake, I wondered when I'd hear from you." "We need to talk," Blake said, "about Emma, about how we're going to handle this separation." "Finally ready to be reasonable?" There was smugness in Tiffany's voice, the satisfaction of someone who thought they held all the cards. "I want what's best for Emma," Blake said, "and I think we can work something out without involving lawyers." It was the perfect thing to say. Tiffany and her parents had been building their case around the assumption that Blake would fight them, that he'd try to take Emma away and contest the divorce. The idea that he might be willing to negotiate, to accept a lesser settlement in exchange for a peaceful resolution, would be irresistible to them. "I think that's very mature of you," Tiffany said. "Why don't you come by the house Saturday afternoon? We can discuss the details." Blake agreed, knowing that Tiffany would immediately call her parents and Rick to share the good news. Rodriguez would monitor those calls and report back. By Saturday, Blake would know exactly what they were planning to offer him and exactly how confident they were that he'd accept it. But Blake Morrison wasn't going to accept anything. He was going to take everything. That night, Blake sat in his apartment with Emma's homework spread out on the coffee table between them. She was working on a math worksheet, simple addition and subtraction problems that she solved with the same methodical approach Blake used for structural calculations. "Daddy?" Emma said without looking up from her work. "Are you and Mommy getting divorced?" Blake set down the report he'd been reading. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "Kids at school said their parents got divorced when their daddies moved out." Emma finally looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. "Are you mad at me? Is that why you won't come home?" Blake felt something break inside his chest. He moved to the couch and pulled Emma onto his lap, holding her the way he had that night in the hotel room. "Emma, listen to me very carefully," Blake said. "I'm not mad at you. I will never be mad at you for wanting a cookie or for any normal thing that kids do. What happened at the house was not your fault, and you did nothing wrong. But Mommy said—" "Mommy was wrong," Blake said firmly. "And Grandpa Gerald was wrong. You are smart and kind and wonderful, and you can be anything you want to be when you grow up." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Will I still get to see you if you and Mommy get divorced?" "You'll see me every day," Blake said. "I promise you that." It was a promise Blake intended to keep, no matter what it cost Tiffany and her family. Emma deserved better than parents who would use her as a weapon. Better than grandparents who would break her spirit for their own amusement. Better than a mother who would choose a personal trainer over her own daughter's well-being. Blake Morrison was going to make sure she got it. The meeting at the Cherry Hills house went exactly as Blake had expected. Tiffany had dressed for the occasion in a way that was meant to remind him of what he was losing. A designer dress that hugged her figure, makeup applied with professional precision, her blonde hair styled in loose waves. She looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, which was exactly the point. Gerald and Donna flanked her in the living room like expensive bookends, their faces wearing expressions of carefully controlled sympathy. They were playing the role of reasonable people forced to deal with an unreasonable situation. "Blake," Tiffany said, gesturing to the leather chair across from the couch where the three of them sat. "I'm glad you're finally ready to discuss this like adults." Blake sat down, keeping his expression neutral. The house felt foreign to him now, like a museum display of someone else's life. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The family photos on the mantel, Emma's artwork held to the refrigerator with magnets, the throw pillow he'd bought Tiffany for her birthday last year. But none of it felt real anymore. "I've been thinking about what's best for Emma," Blake said, "and I think you're right that we don't need to make this more complicated than it has to be." Gerald's eyebrows raised slightly. He'd been prepared for a fight, maybe even looking forward to it. Blake's reasonableness was throwing off their script. "Well," Gerald said, clearing his throat, That's good to hear, son." Blake had to resist the urge to point out that Gerald had never called him son during the 8 years he'd been married to Tiffany. But playing his role required him to accept the olive branch, however insincere. "I know Emma needs stability," Blake continued, "and this house is her home. I don't want to disrupt her life any more than necessary." Tiffany leaned forward slightly, scenting victory. "Exactly. And while this is difficult for all of us, I think we can work out an arrangement that everyone can live with," Tiffany said. For the next hour, they laid out their terms with the kind of careful magnanimity that barely concealed their satisfaction. Blake would get Emma every other weekend and 1 evening per week. He would pay child support based on his current salary plus alimony that would allow Tiffany to maintain her lifestyle. He would sign over his interest in the house and take responsibility for half the marital debt. It was, Blake realized, almost exactly what Rodriguez had predicted they would offer. They'd calculated the minimum they could give him while still appearing reasonable to a divorce court judge. "I think these terms are fair," Donna said when Tiffany finished outlining their proposal, "considering the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Blake asked mildly. Gerald and Tiffany exchanged a glance. "Well," Gerald said, "your episode when you took Emma from the house, that kind of instability is concerning when it comes to custody arrangements." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "I can see how you might view it that way." "We're not trying to punish you, Blake," Tiffany said, reaching across the coffee table to touch his hand. "We're just trying to protect Emma. And honestly, with your work schedule, every other weekend is probably all the time you'd have for her anyway." Blake looked down at Tiffany's hand on his. Her engagement ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The same ring he'd bought with money saved from 2 years of working double shifts, back when he'd believed their future was worth sacrificing for. "I'll need to think about it," Blake said. "Talk it over with Emma, maybe consult with a lawyer just to make sure I understand everything." "Of course," Tiffany said quickly. "Take your time. But Blake, I hope you understand that the longer this drags out, the harder it gets for everyone, especially Emma." The implied threat was subtle but clear. The longer Blake resisted, the more difficult they would make things for him, and they were confident they had all the leverage. Blake left the house with their written proposal and a timeline for his response. They wanted an answer within 2 weeks. which would allow them to file the paperwork before the holidays. A Christmas divorce wrapped up with a neat bow. What they didn't know was that while they'd been delivering their ultimatum, Blake's own plan had been advancing on multiple fronts. Danny Clove's company had made Rick Valdez an offer he couldn't refuse, a 6-figure consulting contract that would solve all his financial problems while getting him out of Denver for 6 months. Rick had accepted immediately, probably seeing it as a chance to start fresh in Los Angeles while keeping his options open in Denver. Lauren had completed her preliminary financial analysis of Gerald's businesses and found some interesting irregularities in the dealership's books. Nothing illegal, necessarily, but several transactions suggested Gerald was more creative with his tax obligations than the IRS might appreciate. More importantly, she traced Tiffany's recent spending patterns and discovered that someone had been very generous with cash gifts that exactly matched the amount Rick had been paying toward his back rent. But the most significant development had come from Rodriguez's surveillance. Rick Valdez wasn't planning to go to Los Angeles alone. He'd asked Tiffany to come with him, at least for the first month, to help him get settled. Tiffany had agreed, apparently seeing it as a romantic adventure. She'd already arranged for Emma to stay with Gerald and Donna while she was gone, telling them she needed time to find herself after the stress of the separation. Blake now had everything he needed for the next phase of his plan. That evening, while Emma worked on a puzzle at the coffee table, Blake called his own lawyer for the first time since Rodriguez had started his investigation. Patricia Chin wasn't the most expensive divorce attorney in Denver, but she was arguably the most effective. She'd built her reputation on meticulous preparation and an aggressive approach that caught opposing counsel off guard. Blake had chosen her specifically because she was everything Tiffany's lawyer wasn't: hungry, thorough, and completely without sentiment. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia said when Blake reached her office line, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Word gets around in legal circles when someone hires Miguel Rodriguez. I assume that means you know why I'm calling. I assume it means you're ready to stop playing defense and start playing offense," Patricia replied. "Are you prepared to win, Mr. Morrison? Because if you're looking for an amicable settlement, you don't need me." Blake thought about Emma on her knees in that bathroom, about Tiffany's smug confidence this afternoon, about Gerald's casual cruelty toward a 6-year-old child. "I'm prepared to win," Blake said. "Good. My office tomorrow at 9. Bring everything: financial records, Rodriguez's reports, any communications you've had with your wife since the separation. And Mr. Morrison, from this point forward, you don't talk to your wife or her family without me present. They think they're dealing with the same man who let them walk all over him for 8 years. Time to show them how wrong they are." Blake hung up and looked over at Emma, who had successfully completed her puzzle. A picture of a castle with tall towers and strong walls. "Look, Daddy," Emma said proudly. "I built a castle." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Blake said. "A castle needs strong foundations to protect the people inside." "Like our apartment," Emma said. "Like our apartment," Blake agreed. "But bigger. Much bigger." Rick Valdez left for Los Angeles on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Blake's meeting at the house. Rodriguez documented his departure from DIA with the kind of thoroughness that Blake had come to appreciate. Photos of Rick loading his luggage, boarding pass information, even the gate number. Within 6 hours, Rick was in California, beginning his new job in the next chapter of his carefully orchestrated destruction. Blake received the confirmation text from Rodriguez while he was reviewing structural calculations for the Millennium Tower project. It was fitting, Blake thought, that he was analyzing foundation problems while putting the finishing touches on his own plan to bring down Tiffany's world. The timing was crucial. Tiffany would be joining Rick in Los Angeles in 10 days, ostensibly for a 3-week soul-searching trip that would help her process the divorce. She'd already arranged for Emma to stay with Gerald and Donna, who had embraced their role as the long-suffering grandparents forced to clean up their daughter's messy life. What Tiffany didn't know was that Blake had been documenting every aspect of her abandonment of Emma. Every dinner she'd missed to meet Rick, every school event she'd skipped to spend time at the hotel, every conversation where she'd prioritized her affair over her daughter's needs. Rodriguez's surveillance had captured it all, creating a comprehensive record of a mother who had already checked out of her child's life months before the separation. Lauren's financial investigation had also borne fruit. Gerald's creative accounting practices weren't just morally questionable, they were potentially criminal. Lauren had identified a pattern of cash transactions that suggested he was skimming money from the dealerships to avoid taxes. It wasn't enough to put him in prison, but it was more than enough to trigger an IRS audit that would cost him hundreds of thousands in penalties and legal fees. But Blake's most devastating discovery had come from an unexpected source. Danny Clove had called Blake 3 days after Rick arrived in Los Angeles. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Your boy Rick is an even bigger piece of work than you thought," Danny had said without preamble. "What did you find?" "He's been bragging to the other trainers out here about his system for seducing wealthy women. Apparently he doesn't just sleep with them. He gets them to pay for his lifestyle. And Blake, he's been recording them." Blake had gone very still. "Recording them? How?" "Video, audio, compromising photos. He keeps it all as insurance in case any of them try to cut him off or cause problems for him. One of the trainers here used to work with him in Denver. Guy says Rick's got material on at least a dozen women, including your wife." Blake needed to get his hands on that material before Rick realized his comfortable situation in Denver was about to disappear permanently. That evening, Blake had dinner with Emma at their favorite pizza place. She'd been quieter than usual lately, asking fewer questions about when they might go back to the house or see Mommy. Blake wasn't sure if she was adjusting to their new life or just learning not to hope for things that wouldn't happen. "Daddy," Emma said, picking pepperoni off her slice and eating them one by one. Jessica at school said her daddy has a new house and her mommy has a new house, and she gets to choose which one she wants to live in. Blake set down his own slice. "Is that something you'd want, sweetheart?" To choose. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all difficult questions. "I want to live with you," she said finally, "but I want Mommy to be happy too. Is that okay?" Blake felt his heart break a little bit more. Even after everything Tiffany had done, Emma still loved her mother and wanted her to be happy. It was the kind of pure, unconditional love that Blake was fighting to protect. "That's perfectly okay," Blake said. "And you know what? After all this legal stuff is finished, I think you're going to get to make a lot more choices about how you want things to be." "Will I get to choose if Grandpa Gerald has to be nice to me?" Blake looked at his daughter's serious face and made a decision that had been building for weeks. "Emma, what would you think about going to see a nice lady who talks to kids about their feelings? Someone who can help you understand that the way Grandpa Gerald treated you was wrong and that you never have to let anyone treat you that way again." Emma perked up slightly. "Like a feelings doctor?" "Exactly like a feelings doctor." Blake had already researched child psychologists who specialized in emotional abuse cases. Dr. Sarah Winters had 20 years of experience working with children who had been traumatized by family members. More importantly, she was qualified to provide expert testimony in custody cases about a child's best interests. The next morning, Blake called Dr. Winters' office and made an appointment. Then he called Patricia Chin. "It's time," Blake told his lawyer. "I want you to file for full custody of Emma, and I want you to ask for an emergency hearing." "What's changed?" Patricia asked. "Tiffany's abandoning Emma to go to California with her boyfriend. She's leaving Emma with the same people who forced her to scrub toilets as punishment for taking a cookie, and I can prove all of it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Blake, this is going to get ugly. They're going to fight back hard, and they're going to try to destroy you in the process." "Let them try," Blake said. "I'm not the same man they think they're dealing with." "No," Patricia agreed. "You're not. I'll file the paperwork this afternoon." Blake ended the call, feeling a new sense of resolve settle over him. Blake spent the rest of the day at work trying to focus on structural load calculations while his phone buzzed with updates from Rodriguez. Tiffany had received the custody papers at 3:47 p.m., served by a process server who had waited for her at the yoga studio. She'd immediately called her lawyer, then her parents, then Rick in Los Angeles. Gerald had arrived at the house within an hour, his face purple with rage. Through their contacts at the courthouse, Patricia had learned that Tiffany's legal team was scrambling to prepare a response. They'd assumed Blake would stick to their agreed timeline, giving them weeks to prepare their case. Instead, they had 48 hours to explain to a judge why a mother should be allowed to abandon her 6-year-old daughter to pursue an affair in another state. Blake picked up Emma from school as usual, maintaining their routine even as everything else fell apart around them. She chatted about her day, about the book they were reading in class, about the art project they'd started in the morning. Normal, beautiful 6-year-old concerns that reminded Blake why he was fighting so hard. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Blake sat in his apartment with Rodriguez's final report spread out on the coffee table. Photos, financial records, phone records, hotel receipts, travel confirmations, everything that documented Tiffany's affair and her neglect of Emma. Everything that proved Gerald and Donna were unfit to care for a child they'd already traumatized once. Blake's phone rang at 11:43 p.m. Tiffany's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, Blake considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of him. Blake. Tiffany's voice was tight with controlled fury. What the heck do you think you're doing? I'm protecting my daughter, Blake said calmly. Your daughter? She's my daughter too, and you can't just... Actually, I can, Blake interrupted. And I did. You're welcome to explain to the judge why you think Emma should stay with your parents while you go to California with your boyfriend. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Blake wondered if she'd hung up. I don't know what you think you know, Tiffany said finally, but you're making a mistake. We had a deal, Blake. We were going to keep this civilized. The deal was off the moment you decided to abandon Emma, Blake said. But don't worry, Tiffany. I'm sure you and Rick will be very happy in Los Angeles. I heard the weather's nice this time of year. Blake hung up and turned off his phone. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. But tonight, for the first time in months, Blake Morrison felt like he was exactly where he belonged, standing between his daughter and the people who would hurt her, ready to fight for as long as it took. The emergency custody hearing took place on a gray November morning, 6 months after Blake had found Emma on her knees in that bathroom. Judge Catherine Brennan presided over a courtroom that felt more like a battlefield than a place of justice, with Tiffany's expensive legal team on one side and Blake with Patricia Chin on the other. Blake had prepared for this moment with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to engineering projects. Every piece of evidence was catalogued, every argument rehearsed, every possible counterattack anticipated. But seeing Tiffany across the courtroom, dressed in a conservative navy suit that was meant to make her look like a responsible mother, still sent a surge of cold anger through his chest. Patricia had warned Blake that the hearing would be brutal. They're going to paint you as a controlling husband who abandoned his family, she'd said during their prep session. They're going to say you're using Emma as a weapon to hurt your wife, and they're going to try to make you lose your temper. Blake had assured her that wouldn't be a problem. Blake Morrison had spent 6 months learning to channel his rage into something more useful than anger. Tiffany's lawyer, Patricia Henley, opened with exactly the argument Patricia Chin had predicted. Blake was an absent father who had prioritized work over family for years. His sudden interest in custody was motivated by revenge, not love. His removal of Emma from the family home had been traumatic and destabilizing for the child. Mr. Morrison has shown a pattern of controlling behavior, Henley argued, culminating in his decision to take Emma from her home without warning or explanation. This is not the action of a loving father. This is the action of a man using his child to punish his estranged wife. When Patricia Chin stood to present Blake's case, she began with a simple statement. Your Honor, this case is not about a marriage that ended badly. This case is about a child who deserves to be protected from abuse. The photos Rodriguez had taken hit the courtroom like bombs. Emma on her knees scrubbing a toilet while wearing an apron marked maid. The tears on her face, the cleaning chemicals in her hair, the red marks on her knees from the hard tile floor, Gerald's beer bottle sitting on the bathroom counter while he watched a 6-year-old child's humiliation. Judge Brennan's face went rigid as Patricia Chin walked her through each image. "This is what Mrs. Morrison calls appropriate discipline," Patricia said. "This is what Mr. Gerald Patterson calls learning her place, and this is what Emma Morrison experienced while her father was traveling for work, trusting that his wife and in-laws would care for their daughter." Henley objected, claiming the photos were inflammatory and taken out of context. Judge Brennan overruled her and asked to see the photos again. Patricia Chin then presented the surveillance evidence of Tiffany's affair. Hotel receipts, photographs, phone records, everything that documented Tiffany's double life while she was supposedly caring for Emma. The evidence showed a pattern of neglect that stretched back months before Blake had discovered the affair. "Mrs. Morrison has already abandoned her daughter emotionally," Patricia argued. "Now she wants to abandon her physically to pursue a relationship with Rick Valdez in California. Meanwhile, she expects this court to leave Emma in the care of the same people who forced her to scrub toilets as punishment for taking a cookie." When Dr. Sarah Winters took the stand as an expert witness, her testimony was devastating. She had interviewed Emma extensively over the past month, documenting the psychological impact of the bathroom incident and Gerald's verbal abuse. "Emma exhibits classic signs of trauma from emotional abuse," Dr. Winters testified. "She's developed anxiety around expressing normal childhood needs, particularly around food. She repeatedly asked me if she was stupid and whether her father would get tired of her and leave her with her grandparents. In my professional opinion, placing Emma back in the care of Gerald and Donna Patterson would be actively harmful to her psychological development." Henley tried to cross-examine Dr. Winters, suggesting that Blake had coached Emma or influenced her statements. Dr. Winters calmly explained that children Emma's age cannot fabricate the kind of detailed, consistent trauma responses she had documented. By the time Blake took the stand, Tiffany's case was already crumbling, but Patricia Chin wasn't finished. "Mr. Morrison, in your opinion, what kind of mother abandons her 6-year-old daughter to pursue an affair in another state?" "Objection," Henley called out. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Patricia said smoothly. "Mr. Morrison, are you prepared to provide Emma with a stable home environment?" "Yes," Blake said. "Emma and I have established a routine that prioritizes her emotional and physical well-being. She's thriving in our current living situation." "And are you willing to facilitate a relationship between Emma and her mother, assuming appropriate safeguards are in place?" Blake looked directly at Tiffany when he answered. "I'm willing to do whatever is in Emma's best interest as long as she's protected from further harm." Judge Brennan called a recess to review the evidence. Blake sat in the hallway with Patricia Chin, watching Tiffany argue frantically with her lawyer and parents. Gerald kept pointing at Blake, his face red with indignation. Donna dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the grieving grandmother. "How do you think it went?" Blake asked Patricia. "I think they're finished," Patricia replied with professional satisfaction. "But the real question is whether they're smart enough to know it." When court reconvened, Judge Brennan delivered her ruling with the kind of controlled anger that suggested she'd seen too many cases like this one. "This court finds that Emma Morrison has been subjected to emotional abuse by her maternal grandparents and that her mother has demonstrated a pattern of neglect and poor judgment that makes her unfit for primary custody at this time." Blake felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for 6 months. Full custody is awarded to Blake Morrison with supervised visitation for Tiffany Morrison pending completion of parenting classes and psychological evaluation. Gerald and Donna Patterson are barred from unsupervised contact with Emma Morrison until further order of this court. Tiffany's sob echoed through the courtroom, but Blake felt no satisfaction. This wasn't victory. This was just the first step in protecting Emma from people who should have loved her unconditionally. The real celebration, Blake decided, would come later. 3 weeks later, Blake and Emma sat at the head table during Thanksgiving dinner at Blake's sister Lauren's house in Chicago. Emma wore a purple dress she'd picked out herself and chattered happily with her cousins about school, books, and the new unicorn backpack Blake had bought her. It was Emma who first noticed the news alert on Lauren's phone.
"Daddy, why is Grandpa Gerald on TV?"
Blake looked over at the phone screen where a local Denver news reporter was standing in front of Gerald Patterson's flagship dealership. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, Local businessman faces tax evasion charges. Lauren turned up the volume as the reporter explained that Gerald Patterson had been arrested that morning on charges of tax evasion and fraud. The IRS investigation had uncovered a systematic pattern of unreported income spanning nearly a decade. If convicted, Patterson faced up to 20 years in federal prison and millions in fines and penalties. Blake pulled out his own phone and found a text from Rodriguez. Rick Valdez arrested in L.A. yesterday. Multiple counts of extortion and blackmail. Turns out several of his victims decided to press charges after his insurance files were turned over to police. Thought you'd want to know. Blake smiled and put his phone away. Rick's arrest would hit the news in Denver within a few days, along with details about his relationship with multiple married women, including Tiffany. The scandal would destroy what was left of Tiffany's reputation and credibility. "Blake," Lauren said, looking at him with a knowing expression. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about Gerald's tax problems, would you? I might have mentioned to someone that they should look more carefully at his business practices," Blake said mildly. "Just being a good citizen." Emma tugged on Blake's sleeve. "Daddy, is Grandpa Gerald going to jail?" Blake knelt down to Emma's level, looking into her serious, dark eyes. "Maybe, sweetheart. Sometimes people who do bad things have to face consequences." "Will he still be mean to kids in jail?" "I don't think he'll be around any kids for a very long time," Blake said. Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can I have more turkey?" "You can have anything you want," Blake told her. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on Lauren's couch, Blake stepped out onto the back porch where Lauren was having a cigarette. Chicago stretched out before them, lights twinkling in the November darkness. "I have to ask," Lauren said, blowing smoke into the cold air. "Did you plan all of this? Gerald's arrest, Rick's troubles in L.A., even the timing?" Blake considered the question. "I planned to protect my daughter from people who had hurt her. Everything else was just consequences." "Consequences?" Lauren repeated. "Blake, you destroyed 3 people's lives in 6 months." "No," Blake said quietly. "They destroyed their own lives. I just made sure everyone could see it." Lauren stubbed out her cigarette and looked at her brother. "You know Tiffany's going to try to rebuild, right? She'll blame you for everything, play the victim, try to come back into Emma's life once this all dies down." Blake nodded. "Let her try. I've got full custody and a documented pattern of her abandonment and poor judgment. Plus, after the scandal with Rick breaks, no judge in Colorado will take her seriously as a fit parent. And if she tries something extra legal," Blake's smile was cold enough to match the November air, "then she'll learn that I'm not the same man who let her walk all over him for 8 years. Through the porch window, Blake could see Emma sleeping peacefully on the couch, finally safe from people who would use her as a weapon or punish her for being a normal child. She was surrounded by family who loved her unconditionally. Lauren, her husband David, their 2 kids who had immediately claimed Emma as their favorite cousin. Blake Morrison had spent 8 years building a life with someone who didn't deserve it. Now he was building something better, a life where Emma would never have to apologize for being herself, never have to fear being punished for normal childhood behavior, never have to choose between her own well-being and someone else's selfish desires. It was, Blake thought, the best foundation he'd ever laid. 6 months after the Thanksgiving arrests made national news, Blake Morrison sat in his new office overlooking downtown Denver, reviewing the architectural plans for Emma's new school. He'd taken a position as lead structural engineer for Morrison and Associates, his own firm, funded by the divorce settlement that had left Tiffany with virtually nothing after her legal fees, and the scandal destroyed her credibility in court. The irony wasn't lost on him that Tiffany's family money, combined with Blake's own savings and a strategic business loan, had given him the capital to start the company he'd always dreamed of owning. He specialized in schools and community centers, now buildings that would protect and nurture children rather than just house corporations. Emma attended Denver Academy, a private school known for its emphasis on emotional intelligence and creative problem-solving. At 7 years old, she was thriving in ways Blake had never imagined possible. The quiet, fearful child who had once apologized for wanting cookies had transformed into a confident little girl who asked thoughtful questions and made friends easily. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez, package delivered as requested. Blake smiled and returned to his architectural plans. Today was the day Tiffany would receive the final piece of information she needed to understand exactly how completely she had lost. The package was a USB drive containing copies of every video, photo, and audio recording Rick Valdez had made during his relationships with married women in Denver. The Los Angeles police had seized Rick's files as evidence, but Rodriguez had obtained copies through his law enforcement contacts before the official investigation began. The recordings included hours of footage of Tiffany and Rick together, some romantic, some sexual, all deeply compromising. But more importantly, they included conversations where Tiffany had detailed her plans to destroy Blake in the divorce, take Emma away from him permanently, and relocate to Los Angeles with Rick using Blake's money. The USB drive also contained a letter from Blake, handwritten on his personal stationery. The Mac's eyes who said stayed to heavy listen to Sunbur. Tiffany. By now, you've probably realized that nothing that happened over the past year was accidental. Rick's job offer in Los Angeles, your father's tax problems, Rick's arrest, even the timing of our custody hearing, all of it was planned. You thought you were dealing with the same man who spent 8 years letting you and your family treat him like a second-class citizen in his own home. You were wrong. I know about Rick's recording system. I know about the videos he made of you. The conversations you had about destroying me, the plans you made to take Emma away from her father. I know about every cruel thing you said about our daughter. Every time you chose Rick over Emma's well-being. Every moment you prioritized your affair over your responsibilities as a mother. The police in Los Angeles have copies of everything. So do several news organizations in Denver. So far, they've agreed to keep your identity private. But that protection has conditions. You will not attempt to regain custody of Emma. You will not violate the restraining order keeping you away from our daughter. You will not contact Emma, me, or anyone associated with our new life. If you do any of these things, every recording Rick made will become public immediately. Your father will serve every day of his 20-year sentence. Rick will serve every day of his 15-year sentence. You are free to rebuild your life however you choose, as long as that life doesn't include harming my daughter. Emma asks about you sometimes. She misses her mother, but she understands that you made choices that hurt her. She's a resilient little girl, and she's healing every day. I hope that one day you'll find the strength to be the mother she deserves. But until then, stay away from us. For your sake and for hers. Blake. Mine was caused. Blake set down the letter feeling a sense of finality. He had done everything he could to protect Emma and ensure that Tiffany could never hurt her again. Now it was time to move forward and focus on building a brighter future for his daughter. I'd tell her that you're sick and getting help, which is more kindness than you showed her when you forced her to scrub toilets for taking a cookie. Maybe someday you'll actually become the kind of person who deserves a relationship with her. But that day is not today, and it won't be tomorrow. I hope you learned something from all of this. I hope you understand that actions have consequences, even when those consequences are delayed. I hope you realize that the man you married was capable of much more than you ever imagined. But mostly, I hope you stay far away from my daughter and let her grow up in peace. Blake Morrison. Blake finished reviewing the school plans and looked out his office window at the city where he'd built, lost, and rebuilt his life. Somewhere out there, Tiffany was probably reading his letter and watching the videos that documented her affair and her plans to destroy him. Somewhere else, Gerald was sitting in a federal prison cell, learning what it felt like to be powerless and humiliated. Rick was in a California prison, facing the consequences of years of manipulating and blackmailing vulnerable women. Blake felt no guilt about any of it. These people had chosen to hurt a 6-year-old child, and Blake had simply ensured they faced appropriate consequences for that choice. His phone rang and Emma's school appeared on the caller ID. "Mr. Morrison, this is Mrs. Peterson from Emma's class. I wanted to let you know that Emma won the school's Young Inventor competition today. She designed a playground structure that would be safer for kids with mobility challenges." Blake smiled, feeling a familiar surge of pride. "That's wonderful. How did she come up with the idea?" "She said she wanted to make sure no kids felt left out or different," Mrs. Peterson replied. "She's quite the problem solver." After hanging up, Blake gathered his things and headed out to pick up Emma from school. She would want to celebrate her victory with ice cream and a trip to the bookstore, and Blake had learned to treasure these small, perfect moments. As he drove through downtown Denver, Blake reflected on the past year. He'd lost a wife, a house, and the illusion that good intentions were enough to protect the people you loved, but he'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he was capable of protecting Emma from anyone who would hurt her, no matter how powerful they thought they were. Blake Morrison had learned to build things that lasted, but more importantly, he'd learned to tear down things that were broken beyond repair, clearing the ground for something better. Emma was waiting for him in the school's pickup area, her face bright with excitement as she clutched her inventor's certificate. When she saw Blake's truck, she ran toward him with the kind of unbridled joy that reminded him why every moment of the past year had been worth it. "Daddy! I won the contest!" Blake caught her as she launched herself into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed. "I heard. Tell me all about it." As Emma chattered about her project and her plans for the prize money she'd won, Blake made a mental note to call the contractor working on the new community center project. He wanted to discuss incorporating some of Emma's accessibility ideas into the playground design. After all, Blake Morrison was in the business of building things that would protect children. And he'd learned that sometimes the best way to build something beautiful was to first destroy everything ugly that stood in its way. 2 years after the custody hearing that changed everything, Blake Morrison stood in the lobby of the Colorado State Penitentiary, waiting for his name to be called. He'd driven 3 hours from Denver for this meeting, leaving Emma with Lauren for the weekend. This was a conversation that required his full attention and complete privacy. Gerald Patterson had aged a decade in the 2 years since his arrest. Federal prison had stripped away the pompous bluster Blake remembered, leaving behind a gaunt man with gray skin and hollow eyes. He moved slowly as he entered the visiting room, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his diminished frame. Blake had requested this meeting through Gerald's lawyer, ostensibly to discuss Emma's future. What he really wanted was to look Gerald Patterson in the eye and deliver a message that had been 2 years in the making. "Blake," Gerald said as he sat down across from the scarred metal table. His voice was hoarse, uncertain. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I keep my promises," Blake replied, "even the ones I make to people who don't deserve them." Gerald's hands shook slightly as he clasped them on the table. "How is she? How is Emma?" Blake studied the man who had once called his daughter stupid, who had sat drinking beer while she cried and scrubbed a toilet bowl. Gerald looked genuinely broken, and Blake wondered if 2 years of consequences had taught him anything about the kind of man he'd been. "Emma is exceptional," Blake said. "She's 8 years old now. She speaks 3 languages, plays violin, and won the state science fair last month with a project on renewable energy. She's kind, confident, and completely uninterested in seeking approval from people who don't deserve it." Gerald's eyes filled with tears. Does she ever ask about me?" Blake leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "No, she's asked about you exactly twice in 2 years. The first time I told her you were in a place where people go when they hurt children. The second time she asked if you were sorry for being mean to her. I told her I didn't know." "I am sorry," Gerald whispered. "God, Blake, I'm so sorry. I never meant—" "You meant every word," Blake interrupted. "You meant every cruel thing you said to a 6-year-old child. You meant to break her spirit because it made you feel powerful. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." Gerald flinched as if Blake had struck him. "Please, I know I was wrong. I know I hurt her, but she's my granddaughter and She's not your granddaughter, Blake said quietly. Grandfathers protect their grandchildren. Grandfathers make them feel safe and loved and valued. You're just a man who shares DNA with someone I used to be married to. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the murmur of other conversations in the visiting room. Gerald wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that made him look older and more fragile than Blake had ever seen him. "What do you want from me?" Gerald asked finally. "Nothing," Blake said. "I didn't come here because I want something from you. I came here because I wanted you to understand exactly what you lost." Blake pulled out his phone and showed Gerald a photo from Emma's birthday party the month before. Emma was laughing as she blew out the candles on her cake, surrounded by friends from school and family who loved her unconditionally. Her face was bright with happiness and confidence, the face of a child who knew she was valued and protected. "This is what Emma looks like when she's surrounded by people who love her," Blake said. "This is the joy you'll never see, the laughter you'll never hear, the love you'll never earn. Emma is going to grow up to be an extraordinary woman, and you'll never be part of that story." Gerald stared at the photo with naked longing. "Please, Blake, I'm dying in here. The doctors say I have maybe 2 years left. Couldn't I see her just once? Couldn't I try to make amends?" Blake put his phone away and stood up. "Gerald, you had 8 years to be a grandfather to Emma. 8 years to show her kindness and love and respect. Instead, you chose to be cruel. You chose to humiliate a child for your own amusement. Those choices have consequences." Blake paused at the door and looked back at the broken man in the orange jumpsuit. "Emma will live her entire life without ever thinking about you again. She'll graduate from high school, go to college, maybe get married and have children of her own. She'll build a beautiful life filled with people who love and respect her, and you'll never be part of any of it." Blake left the prison feeling lighter than he had in months. Some people might call his visit cruel, but Blake preferred to think of it as closure. Gerald Patterson would spend his remaining years understanding exactly what his cruelty had cost him, and Blake found that fitting. The drive back to Denver gave Blake time to think about the other loose ends he'd been managing. Tiffany had remarried 6 months earlier to a man named David Cho who owned a chain of dry cleaning stores in Phoenix. According to Rodriguez's occasional updates, Tiffany had reinvented herself as a grieving mother whose ex-husband had cruelly separated her from her daughter. David seemed to believe her story, at least publicly. Blake didn't particularly care about Tiffany's new life as long as it stayed far away from Emma. The restraining order was permanent, and the threat of releasing Rick's recordings had kept Tiffany from attempting any contact. Blake suspected she'd eventually try to reach out to Emma when Emma was older, but that would be Emma's choice to make as an adult. Rick Valdez was serving 12 years in California State Prison for extortion and sexual assault. Several of his victims had come forward after his arrest, painting a picture of a predator who had systematically targeted vulnerable women for financial and emotional exploitation. Blake had received thank you letters from 3 of Rick's victims, women whose lives had been destroyed by his blackmail schemes until Blake's evidence allowed them to see justice. Blake's phone rang as he crossed the Denver city limits. Lauren's name appeared on the screen. "How did it go?" Lauren asked without preamble. "Exactly as expected," Blake replied. "Gerald's dying, Tiffany's remarried, and Emma is building a volcano for her science project." "A volcano?" Lauren asked. "Should I be worried about my house?" Blake laughed. "It's for school. Although, knowing Emma, it'll probably be the most scientifically accurate volcano in 3rd grade history." "She gets that from you," Lauren said. "The attention to detail and the ruthlessness when someone threatens what she loves." "That too," Lauren agreed. "Are you picking her up tonight or tomorrow morning?" "Tonight. I miss her." Like meant 2 years of having Emma to himself had created a bond between them that felt unbreakable. She was his constant companion, his greatest achievement, his reason for becoming the kind of man who could protect the people he loved from anyone who would hurt them. When Blake arrived at Lauren's house, Emma burst through the front door before he'd even parked the truck. She wore jeans and a purple sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that bounced as she ran toward him. "Daddy, look what Aunt Lauren taught me." Emma held up her hands, which were covered in flour and what appeared to be chocolate chips. "We made cookies, real ones, not the store kind." Blake caught her in his arms, not caring about the flour that transferred to his shirt. "Did you save any for me?" "Of course, but I ate 3 of them. Is that okay? I was really hungry and Aunt Lauren said it was fine, but I wanted to make sure." "Emma," Blake said gently, kneeling down to her level, "it's always okay to eat when you're hungry. You never have to ask permission for that." It had taken 2 years of consistent reassurance, but Emma was finally beginning to trust that her basic needs would always be met without question or punishment. Blake still felt a surge of anger every time she showed signs of the damage Tiffany and her parents had done. But those moments were becoming rarer. "Did you finish your volcano?" Blake asked as they walked toward Lauren's house. "Almost. I just need to add the final chemical mixture. Do you want to see it explode tomorrow?" "I wouldn't miss it," Blake said. That evening, as Blake tucked Emma into bed in the guest room at Lauren's house, she asked the question that had been building in Blake's mind all day. "Daddy, are we going to live in Chicago forever?" Blake smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Do you want to live here forever?" Emma considered this with her usual seriousness. "I like it here. Aunt Lauren makes good cookies and my cousins are fun. But I miss our apartment in Denver, and I like your new office." "Well," Blake said, "what if I told you I've been looking at houses in Denver? Big houses with yards where you could have a dog if you wanted one." Emma's eyes went wide. "Really? A real dog?" "A real dog, and a real yard, and a real bedroom that's all yours with whatever decorations you want." Emma threw her arms around Blake's neck. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, sweetheart, more than all the stars in the sky." As Emma drifted off to sleep, Blake sat in the chair beside her bed and thought about the future they were building together. Morrison and Associates was thriving, with projects booked 6 months in advance. Emma was happy, healthy, and surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. The people who had tried to hurt her were facing appropriate consequences for their choices. Blake Morrison had learned that sometimes the best way to protect the future was to completely destroy the past. But more importantly, he'd learned that love without the willingness to fight for it was just sentiment. Emma deserved better than sentiment. She deserved a father who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe, who would build her a life worthy of the extraordinary person she was becoming. Blake had built her exactly that life, and he'd make sure it lasted forever. 5 years after that November day when everything changed, Blake Morrison stood at the back of the auditorium at Denver Academy, watching his 11-year-old daughter deliver the valedictorian speech for her elementary school graduation. Emma had grown tall and confident, her dark hair now reaching her shoulders and her serious brown eyes sparkling with intelligence and humor. "When I was little," Emma said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong, "I used to think that smart meant never making mistakes. But I learned that smart actually means learning from your mistakes and helping other people learn from theirs too." Blake smiled, recognizing his own influence in Emma's words, but also seeing the unique person she'd become. Emma Morrison was going to change the world someday. Blake was certain of it. "My dad always tells me that we build our lives one choice at a time," Emma continued. "Every day we choose to be kind or mean, brave or scared, helpful or selfish. The choices we make don't just affect us, they affect everyone around us. So, I want to challenge everyone here to make choices that build something beautiful." The audience erupted in applause and Blake felt tears prick his eyes. This was the little girl who had once apologized for being hungry, who had once been forced to scrub toilets while adults laughed at her humiliation. Now she was standing in front of hundreds of people, speaking with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. After the ceremony, Blake waited in the lobby while Emma said goodbye to her classmates. Many of them would be going to different schools in the fall, but Emma had formed genuine friendships that Blake expected would last for years. Mr. Morrison. Blake turned to find Dr. Harrison, Emma's principal, approaching with a warm smile. I wanted to thank you again for your donation to the new playground project. Emma's accessibility designs are really going to make a difference for our students with disabilities. Blake shook the principal's hand. Emma cares about making sure everyone feels included. I'm just proud to support her vision. She's a remarkable young lady, Dr. Harrison said. In my 30 years in education, I've rarely seen a child with such a strong sense of justice combined with genuine compassion. You should be very proud. Blake was proud. Emma had grown into exactly the kind of person Blake had hoped she would become, strong enough to stand up for herself and others, kind enough to care about people who were struggling, smart enough to solve complex problems, and secure enough in her own worth that she didn't need to diminish others to feel important. Emma appeared at Blake's side, still wearing her graduation cap, but with her formal dress now accessorized with a juice stain from the reception. Ready to go home, graduate? Blake asked. Ready, Emma said, then paused. Dad, can we stop at the bookstore on the way home? I want to get a book about architecture. If I'm going to help you design buildings, I should probably learn more about it. Blake's heart swelled. Emma had been accompanying him to job sites for the past year, asking thoughtful questions about structural engineering and showing a natural aptitude for spatial reasoning. Morrison and Associates had become one of Denver's most respected firms, specializing in educational and community buildings that prioritized both function and emotional well-being. We can definitely stop at the bookstore, Blake said, but first I have something to show you. Blake drove Emma to the construction site where Morrison and Associates' latest project was taking shape. The new Denver Children's Hospital wing was still several months from completion, but the steel framework clearly outlined what would become a state-of-the-art facility for pediatric care. This is where sick kids will come to get better, Blake explained as they walked through the construction area, both wearing hard hats. Every decision we made about this building was designed to make children feel safe and hopeful. Emma studied the construction with the same intensity Blake brought to his work. The windows are really big, she observed, so kids can see the sky and feel connected to the outside world even when they have to stay in bed. Blake agreed. And the ceiling is curved instead of flat because curved ceilings feel more like being hugged than being trapped in a box. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I want to design buildings like this someday, buildings that help people instead of just containing them. Blake put his arm around Emma's shoulders as they stood looking at the emerging structure. You can design whatever kind of buildings you want. You can build hospitals or schools or houses or rocket ships. The only limit is your imagination. And my math skills, Emma added practically. You always say good engineering requires good math. Blake laughed. Your math skills are exceptional, but more importantly, your heart is exceptional. The best engineers don't just build structures that won't fall down, they build structures that make people's lives better. That evening, Blake and Emma celebrated her graduation with dinner at their favorite restaurant, followed by a movie and ice cream. It was the kind of simple, perfect day that Blake had learned to treasure. Emma chattered about her plans for middle school, her ideas for improving the hospital design, and her latest book recommendations. As they drove home through Denver's summer twilight, Emma grew quiet. Dad, she said finally, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't taken me away from the house that day? Blake considered the question carefully. Emma knew the broad outline of what had happened with Tiffany and her parents. Blake had always been honest with her in age-appropriate ways, but this was the first time she'd asked such a direct question. I think you would have found a way to survive, Blake said. You're strong and smart and good, Em. Those qualities don't disappear just because other people try to suppress them. But would I be the same person I am now? Blake pulled into their driveway and turned to look at his daughter. Maybe not exactly the same, but you'd still be you. The core of who you are, your kindness, your intelligence, your sense of justice. That comes from inside you, not from outside circumstances. Emma nodded, processing this. I'm glad you took me away, though. I like our life. Me too, kiddo. Me too. Their house was a modest two-story in the Highlands neighborhood, with a large backyard where Emma's golden retriever Newton spent his days chasing tennis balls and digging holes. Blake had bought the house 3 years earlier, choosing it specifically because it felt like a home rather than a showplace. Emma's room was a testament to her evolving interests. Bookshelves lined with everything from Harry Potter to calculus textbooks, a drafting table where she worked on building designs, and walls covered with photographs of architectural marvels from around the world. It was the room of a child who was encouraged to explore her passions without limitation. As Blake tucked Emma into bed, she asked another question that surprised him. "Dad, do you think I'll ever want to see my mom again?" Blake sat on the edge of Emma's bed, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, Em. That's a decision only you can make, and only when you're ready to make it." "If I wanted to see her, would you be okay with that?" Blake nodded. "If you wanted to see her, and if I thought it was safe for you, then yes, I'd be okay with it. My job is to protect you and support you, not to make your decisions for you." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I don't think I want to see her right now. Maybe not ever. Is that mean?" "No, sweetheart. It's not mean to protect yourself from people who have hurt you. You don't owe anyone forgiveness or a relationship, not even family members. You get to choose who's in your life based on how they treat you. Like how you chose to keep me away from Grandpa Gerald." "Exactly like that." Emma smiled and settled deeper into her pillows. "I'm glad I get to choose, and I choose to stay with you." "I choose to stay with you too," Blake said, kissing her forehead. "Sweet dreams, graduate." After Emma fell asleep, Blake went to his home office and pulled out the letter he'd received that morning. It was from Gerald Patterson's lawyer, informing Blake that Gerald had died in prison the previous week. Lung cancer, the letter said. No family members had claimed the body. Blake felt nothing about Gerald's death, no satisfaction, no sadness, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that a chapter had finally closed. Gerald Patterson had spent his final years understanding exactly what his cruelty had cost him, and Blake considered that sufficient justice. Blake filed the letter in the folder where he kept all documentation related to Emma's early life. Court records, medical reports, photos that proved what had been done to her. Emma would have access to all of it when she was older, if she wanted it. Blake believed in transparency, even about difficult truths. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. "Tiffany filed for divorce from husband number 2. Thought you should know." Blake deleted the text without responding. Tiffany's life was no longer his concern as long as she stayed away from Emma. The restraining order was still in effect, and Blake had no intention of allowing any contact until Emma was old enough to make that choice as an adult. Blake looked around his office at the architectural drawings and business plans that represented the life he'd built for himself and Emma. Morrison and Associates now employed 12 people and had projects in 3 states. More importantly, every building they designed incorporated principles of safety, accessibility, and emotional well-being. Blake Morrison had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could build wasn't a structure made of steel and concrete. It was a life of safety, compassion, and hope for those you loved, a legacy that would echo long after you were gone. It was a life made of love, protection, and unwavering commitment to the people who mattered most. Emma Morrison was 11 years old, brilliant, confident, and kind. She would grow up knowing that she was valued and protected, that her voice mattered, and that she could build anything she could imagine. She would never again have to apologize for being hungry, never have to earn love through subservience, never have to accept cruelty from people who claimed to care about her. Blake had built her exactly the life she deserved, and he'd make sure it lasted forever. Outside, Denver sparkled in the summer darkness, full of possibilities and promise. Somewhere in that city, other children were going to bed safe and loved, protected by parents who understood that love without the willingness to fight for it was just sentiment. Blake Morrison understood the difference, and Emma Morrison would grow up understanding it too. The foundation was solid. The structure would last.